Hello and welcome to Language of the Soul podcast. I'm your host, Dominick Domingo.
And I'm your co-host, Virginia Grenier.
We'd like to invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy some inspiring conversation. Here at Language of the Soul, we know that life is story. Individually, we're the products of the stories we tell about ourselves. Culture is the amalgamation of the stories we weave about the human condition. Here's the thing. Individually and collectively, we can write our own story. Thanks for tuning in and joining in the march toward human potential. Hello and welcome to Language of the Soul podcast, where life is story. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a part B to a segment we did a couple weeks ago on the animation renaissance. So I hope you heard it, but if not, I do want this episode to stand alone, so I'll preface it a little bit by saying, our podcast, some of you will know, regular listeners will know, the podcast is based on my book, Language of the Soul. And so we've really found kindred spirits in our guests, people that have either taken great risks to tell their stories in the world or literally had that come to Jesus moment or that dark night of the soul or that kind of existential crisis that put purpose on the front burner. And we're glad to highlight people like that who are on a mission or have a calling or a ministry. And feels really good to give them a space in which to tell their story. However, we haven't really gotten to my book a whole lot. And I do want to get my jollies as well. So we're going to devote a couple mini episodes to reading excerpts from Language of the Soul, the book. In advance of that, I kind of said this in so many words in part A, I was with Disney feature animation for 11 years, huge part of my life. And of course, it led to the other genres and formats in which I've been lucky enough to work, like live action film and the literary realm. But I'm so nostalgic about it lately, in part because we have had a few animation guests. We had Don Hahn, the producer of Lion King, nothing less than a cultural icon. And then we had Andreas Deja, who is, of course, one of the most legendary Disney animators of all time. Did all the villains, Scar, Jafar, Triton, Hercules, who's not a villain. But you get the idea. And so those were really satisfying to me, but we didn't go too in depth because it was done in the context of a CTN, the largest animation convention in the world. So because that really tapped into some nostalgia, being a Scorpio that I carry with me, I just wanted to talk about the animation renaissance. It's never happened again. It was a magical moment in time. And another way of prefacing this is Roger Ellers, one of the two directors of Lion King, is a dear friend to this day. We've kept in touch all these years. And I just went a couple months ago to his 75th birthday party. And man, it wasn't just like a who's who. It was friends and colleagues and people I spent so many hours with bonding, There's not a lot of bonding experiences later in life. And we just spent so many hours in the trenches with this shared love of storytelling. And Roger and I, just over coffee, we will say, man, the stars aligned. That was a magical moment in time where not just master storytellers, but passionate artists with something to say in the world came together and literally changed the face of, you fill in the blank, pop culture, the noosphere, right? The face of social evolution. It was huge. And he pointed out something that I didn't really recognize at 20 when I started the job, but apartheid had just ended in South Africa when we were working on Lion King. So it really keyed into themes that were globally just pervasive at the moment. And my jaw dropped when he said that. I hadn't even processed that. But anyway, more than anything, I'm feeling nostalgic, of course, with my little brush with death that I referenced earlier, that a lot of my guests have had. Of course, legacy's on the front burner. I'm feeling my mortality, and I'm rarely asked about it. Uber drivers, grown men, will say, "Oh, Lion King was my favorite movie as a kid," and I'm like, "Okay, but you're a grown organism." Like, it blows my mind. But as I said on the first episode, my 22 nieces and nephews have literally never asked a single thing, even confirm or deny the rumors about the penis on the video cover of The Little Mermaid or the sex in the clouds on Lion King, even to dispel the urban myths. I'm never asked about it. And as our host, Janna VanVliet, will say, there's not a lot of value to dispelling some of the urban myths and some of the rhetoric around Disney, and we might touch on that. But more importantly, the animation renaissance was a pivotal moment that did change the face of pop culture. Just because I have so many memories I could tap into, I think it's worth talking about. I know what I was going to say. Janna is very aware in my teaching, I really don't talk about my career. I try to let them know who's up there and where my perspectives are coming from, the experience that led largely to what I'm trying to impart. As an instructor, it feels really good to be able to fall back on tried and true conventional things like, Chevreul's laws of color theory or the Gestalt studies, something that can back me up. But within reason, my perspective comes from my experience. So I always do a Reader's Digest version of my career, and it ends right there. And very few people pick my brain. So this is the opportunity to tell my stories. In that spirit, I kind of reached out at one point through CTN, Creative Talent Network. I kind of referenced them a moment ago, the largest animation convention in the world. And I have been a part of it for 15 plus years since its inception. And most recently, I think it was toward the tail end of the pandemic, I did teach a class on the premises at Center Stage Gallery, it's called, which is an extension of CTN. We had a couple international students, and one of them actually showed up in the classroom, and she was a hoot. She was very participatory, very passionate about animation, very immersed in the culture, and I just fell in love with her. So when I reached out, blissfully, she responded and said, "Hey, I'll pick your brain for the benefit of your listeners." So again, please do listen to the former episode if you get a chance. But I'm going to reintroduce our host. I'm going to turn everything over to her so she can interview me. And her name is Janna VanVliet. Janna VanVliet is an energetic visual development artist who loves to create worlds and environments that tell a story, to mentally get into a place that make it speak. She generally is a sucker for heartfelt and emotional story moments, moments she has to rip out of her heart. You will enjoy having Janna on your team for her organized work, unwavering team spirit, and a possible dad joke here and there. Welcome, Janna VanVliet. Woo!
Yay! Yay, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me. It's such an honor.
Of course, we're lucky to have you. I so enjoyed our last episode. I can't wait to recreate the magic. No pressure.
Well, it was fun. So
I'm
let's do
glad.
this
I'm glad.
again.
Woo. Yeah, I always, of course, I hope you get something out of it, but one never knows. We're gonna, of course, put your links in the episode description and maybe get some visibility for your beautiful work. I loved your Christmas card. There's so much spirit, I guess is one way of putting it. Such flair in your work, and specifically the intimate interactions, the acting that goes on between your characters. I've had students and professionals that say, I can't design a character in isolation. They have to be interacting with another character to find their core essence. And I see that in your work, especially the little thumbnails that accompanied your Christmas card. Your character building as you flesh out those little, I don't want to get too technical yet, right? But those story beats.
Yes.
I hope you get that feedback a lot. I mean, it's not every artist that can do lively characters with an inner life.
Well, in this case, if you ever had pet or a big dog that thinks he's a lap dog, you're kind of there.
Well, absolutely. Well, yeah, Bowie thinks he's a lapdog and he's 60
Yeah.
pounds. That's pretty formidable.
That's the idea, right? The bigger the dog, the more they think
Right.
that they should be on your lap.
Dogs, dogs, dogs. Well, in our pre-interview, we were lamenting it's just a strange moment for our listeners. For context,
Hmm.
California's on fire basically, and then the first couple days of the new administration, it's just hell on earth. So we did decide let's talk about puppies and daisies, and what was the other thing we were gonna? Well, the animation renaissance.
And kittens and something with mittens.
Right. Let's not sing it again, please. Don't make me sing.
But you have such a lovely voice.
Mimod.
Exactly. There you
It could
go.
happen. I could break out into song at any time.
Did you have puppies or dogs or cats at the studio when you worked there?
I'm so glad you asked that because it's so emblematic of how society has changed. When I started, yeah, you must have heard rumors. When I started, the background department had rats. cages upon cages of rats. Don't ask me why. But yeah, I can think of a few people that brought their dog to work every day, and it was a non issue. We weren't as litigious back then, right? I think
Mm,
restaurants had health codes, so we were probably more vigilant than, some cultures. I would go to Paris and go to a brasserie, and the owner's dog would sit on your feet while you're eating. So they didn't have the
mm.
strict health codes that we have here. But for whatever reason, here we did have strict health codes in restaurants. But the workplace, yeah, bring your pets. It was totally an open door policy. And then, of course,
That
that
sounds
went,
fun.
yeah, we were not under the radar of corporate Disney and we were left to our own devices. So dogs everywhere, rats in the background department. Don't know why. In
Huh.
cages.
No, cages upon cages.
Yeah,
Yes.
and now all these years later, I do think you have emotional support dogs and
Support?
service dogs.
Oh, service dog. Yes.
Yeah, and the different requirements for each. But I do think now more than ever, you will see dogs in Starbucks, for example, and it's a non-issue. So
Mm,
things change all the time. But it kind of went from dogs and pets everywhere because we were in these little warehouse buildings, kind of again not on the radar of corporate Disney, to
mm.
probably too much legislation around pets in the workplace. And now I think we're back to this culture of support dogs or service dogs justifying all dogs in restaurants, for example. Anyway, things change all the time, and I miss those days. Yeah, we were in warehouse buildings with exposed plumbing and exposed electrical, and then these tiny little cubicles with like warm lights around them, but then this spacious, cavernous building, and just very nostalgic about those days. And once Lion King did so well, they built the building that everybody knows with the Sorcerer's Apprentice cap. Do you know that building?
Mhm. Yes, of
Yeah.
course. Yes.
Yeah, and so we all moved into that, and the fun was kind of over. Corporate Disney was right
Oh.
across the street, the main lot, and over time we would notice the subliminal Mickeys in the architecture. Like, wait a minute,
Mm.
I'll give you one example. There's 3 floors, and then there
Yeah.
are balconies, so you can kind of look down to the lower levels. There
Mhm.
were like little tables where you could hang out on your break, and some of them had
Okay.
phones on them at the time, landlines, but little break areas with circular tables. But only from above, looking down on them from the balcony, could you see they formed a Mickey. Like, 2
Ugh.
circles would be the ears. So I'd call them subliminal Mickeys. And even the host desk in the front had corrugated Mickeys kind of embedded in the paneling. But you had to really look for them. So yeah, I think we were definitely more under the watchful eye of the mouse once we moved into that new building.
Oh, that sounds interesting. That's what's the other open space with the cubicles? Was it more, were you aware of how inspiring that was or how free that was? Did you understand that at that moment?
Well, you may remember in the last episode, I said that my friend Jane Bonnet had given me a tour halfway through Disney. I did get a tour. So I saw the buildings and the hot chocolate and the popcorn and just the really relaxed vibe. And then when I started the job, I was in that very same building that she had given me a tour of. So that's
Mhm.
all I knew, to be honest. But I did learn over time that that moment right around the time of Black Cauldron that I mentioned also, where
Mm.
corporate Disney almost did away with feature animation entirely until they realized, holy crap, 60% of our company's profits still come directly or indirectly from feature animation. They resurrected it. And that's when Little Mermaid did so well and the whole Renaissance took off. But they almost did away with it entirely. So I did learn over time they were actually on the main lot in the ink and paint building
Mhm.
before I started, and then when things kind of, again, were taking a turn for the worst, they relegated feature animation to warehouse buildings in Glendale. They're still
Mm.
there. DreamWorks is in the same industrial area. But we had about 4 or 5 buildings, the Knudsen building, Flower Street building. I can't remember the names of them all, but because Lion King was a new production, we were in the Flower Street building. So I loved it. It was very under the radar, very incognito, and like I said, just very charming, safe spaces. Again, everything changed when they built that building for us.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, when you were in the flower building, did you, because I heard stories about lavish breakfasts and lunches and I don't know, refrigerators filled with everything and anything. Did you have that there as well?
Well, are you sure you're not talking about DreamWorks? Like the free lunches at DreamWorks?
I don't know. I thought that DreamWorks had the Haagen-Dazs and Disney had like all the cornflakes and other stuff people still find.
I'll say this, every animation studio has breakfast cereal. Don't know why. It's a tradition, right? Little machines that dispense the cereal. It's an animation thing. I do joke, especially TV animation or smaller companies, nothing remotely healthy. No granola bars, no fruit. They just want to fatten you up so you can't leave your seat. So you keep working. I'm kind of
That's
kidding, but
horrible.
well, maybe it's changed. I don't
Mm,
remember what you're talking about. I know that DreamWorks, because again, basically all my colleagues jumped ship when all the layoffs
mhm,
were happening, and at one point I knew more people at DreamWorks than I did Disney. I got my brother an interview there. I won't say I got him a job, but I did get him the interview. So I'd go over and just have lunch with colleagues or friends or my brother, and I knew more
mhm.
people at DreamWorks than I did my own workplace. And yes, they
Oh,
had you probably heard, free, literally free lunch. And at one point when they were going to move to Marina Del Rey, they were going to offer helicopter rides for their artists to get them to work. They really rolled out the
right.
red carpet. But I don't remember any lavish breakfasts, sorry. We would go to the main
Oh.
lot mainly, we didn't even have a cafeteria initially. I guess we did, but it was very limited. So often we
Mhm.
would go to the cafeteria on the main lot across the street.
Okay.
Not
Okay, I
complaining.
had no idea.
Maybe
Well,
I missed out there. I missed out on something apparently. They didn't tell me about the lavish breakfasts. Damn it.
mhm. Well, you got to work at Disney though, so that's a good thing.
Right. Can't really complain. Yeah.
Right. So, when you were working at Disney in your flower building, can you walk me through the day? Like you arrived at an certain time, and then what did you do? Where did you go? With whom did you go? What happened?
I guess I'll start by saying it was a very lax atmosphere, as you know. So
Mm,
you didn't punch a clock, which was wonderful, and you didn't really have much. You could kind of show up at whatever time you wanted to, as long as you put in your time. So
mm,
that's awesome for people, you know what I mean? They're married with children and have a household to run because if you have to get your kids off to school, that's priority. And then you show up at 9, 9:30, 10, if need be. But as long as you put
mm-hmm,
in your 8 hours, there was no clock to punch. So I loved that. There was a lot of trust that, there are two kind of archetypes of artists, either passionate, dedicated, like we've said, works hard, or they'll completely fuck off if you let them. So production had both views of artists, but we didn't feel the crack of the whip too much. There was a lot of trust that we were passionate about putting stories out into the world and we would work hard left to our own devices. So I don't know, I would show up myself probably 9, 9:30.
mm,
What would I do? Well, this might, again, I don't want to get too technical this week, but as a background painter, ideally you would be given a layout Monday, let's say.
okay.
And it could be a what we call a sky card, which is just what it sounds like, maybe a portion of a sky with a little
Mm-hmm,
gradation of color. No clouds, just a sky card. That could take you an hour. Or
okay.
it could be, for example, I had a background on Tarzan. At the first time you're seeing Gorilla Home, do you remember when the leopard is basically jumping in the boat and then it kind of crashes down? It's
Right.
when Kala discovers the baby, but the leopard kind of attacks her and she jumps in the boat with the baby. And then again, it lowers to the ground and she kind of runs off across a dilapidated bridge into what we called Gorilla Home. It was the first time the audience was seeing Gorilla Home. So we had
Mhm,
literally, I think, 43 levels of foliage passing the camera as we pushed in to follow Kala. Again, we wanted to really introduce Gorilla Home in a very vivid way. So I had 43 overlays on acetate to paint. That one
wow.
took me a month and a half. So again, a sky card could take you an hour, or the layout you're given Monday could last you a month and a half. So the point is, ideally, so you get the layout, you'd start conceiving it. Maybe there was a color key already, or maybe you have to
Mhm,
do a color key based on neighboring backgrounds from the same sequence. I don't want to get too technical. And then you
mhm, no.
start mixing your paint and you'd go at it.
Right.
Ideally, the art director would do his or her rounds, it's called, with your background supervisor and give you his or her thoughts on the background. Again, let's say you've
Oh,
already done a color key, they will chime in and say, "Oh, that's awesome, but let's have this guy a little more, I don't know, cooler or warmer," and they would give their notes. So you kind of knew what the goal was, and you could
okay.
systematically execute it during the week. In theory, if it's a background that took about a week, your background would then go into an approval meeting on Friday, in which the directors and the art directors and the supervisor of the background department would meet and either approve the background, approve it with
Mm-hmm.
changes where they don't need to see it again, they trust you to do the changes, or it would get back to the drawing board and it would go into the next week's meeting, if that makes sense.
Okay.
That's the framework. Of course, there's all kinds of variations within that if it's a background that takes you a month and a half. And
Sure.
and
Sure.
you just paint. So the rest of my day would be mixing paint. Now you don't have to do that digitally, but a lot
Yeah.
of mixing of paint. And then if you had a really cool office mate like I did, you just turn the radio on and sing harmony all day and tell jokes and just do what you love. Yeah.
And break?
Well, whenever you want. I mean, it was so, yeah, take breaks as you want. But I think the union did mandate, a clear 1 hour lunch break and I think two breaks, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. But again, no structure. A lot of people played ping pong on the breaks. I'm sure you've heard that.
I was gonna ask.
Right. Right. And we had a whole tournament, right? Jeffrey Katzenberg would come and participate or Michael Eisner at one point. Yeah, some people took that very seriously.
But not you?
Nah, I got good at it at one point, but that quickly, yeah, lost its luster for me.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, well. So, another thing that I picked up on is that apparently when you have a lot of artists together and they have this like environment maybe, you have a lot of caricatures and maybe other fun pranks and things going on. Did you participate in that stuff?
I did. Yeah, you would, one year, let's say another animator got you, right? And sometimes it was flattering, sometimes not. And then the next year you'd get them back, right? So it kind of went on forever. And they would hang them in the commissary, as you probably heard, or just hang them around the building. So yeah, I will say I caricatured Mike Giamo early on, the art director of Pocahontas. Don't know that he loved it. And then some of my fellow background painters, but I feel
Hmm.
very honored. John Musker, do you know him?
Yes, of
Ron and
course.
John? Yeah.
Yeah.
John Musker did one of me that I still have to this day. It's a little tattered on the edges. I need to frame it actually. So yeah, those are treasured. They're in my retirement trunk for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. And pranks?
Well, I don't know why this came to mind. I don't recall any pranks per se. But regarding the kind of anything goes, again, it was the 80s and 90s. So the
Yeah.
world has changed. You have way more active human resources departments. Sexual harassment is a thing. It wasn't back
Mm.
then. You have, I keep calling it Title V, but you have diversity and inclusion. And a lot of people are really overdoing their jobs. But when you say prank, it reminds me of a photo that I just saw on Facebook. I'm sure you're aware of the We Worked at Disney animation in the 80s, 90s. Anyway, Don Hahn started the Facebook group and literally within one day there was 1,500 people that had joined. So again, it's a way to keep in touch with my colleagues, very nostalgic. But somebody posted a picture. I can almost think of who posted it. It was somebody's birthday and it was in one of those warehouse buildings, and this dude, this animator, again, I wish the names would come to me, basically in a thong, just delivering the birthday cake with all the candles blazing in a thong. And I mean, later we had Tarzan, like the costumed version of Tarzan, running around in a loincloth, but that was under the guise of approving the costume. But my jaw dropped like, okay, no sexual harassment lawsuits, just everybody having fun. And it's very fun to look at. I'm sure you've heard on Halloween, we would have a gross food competition. And
What?
yeah,
Why?
I don't know why. People would bring, like olives as eyeballs, or you got to stick your hand in the pasta and
Oh,
but
right.
all I could think of, I did a spam sculpture Oh, maybe it was on Emperor's New Groove, and I did it of a llama. So I sculpted a llama out of Spam. Do you know what Spam is?
Yes, I do. That's the mystery meat, right?
That's scary on its own, right? So
Yeah.
it suited the theme.
I mean, a llama out of that, that won't even be pretty. That will probably be gross. That's
It was pretty
yeah.
disturbing, and it did not get eaten, for the record. Well, that was the thing. It was supposed to be edible in theory. I don't think anyone went near the Spam llama, unfortunately.
Well, still A for effort, very creative.
Oh, thank
I
you.
mean, what else would you make it out of? Like peanut butter won't hold, so I get it.
Yeah, Spam, it's I think in Hawaii it's actually haute cuisine, but here
Oh,
it's the bottom of the barrel. Parts is parts. You don't know how many hooves or eyeballs are in that Spam. It's a
nope.
guilty pleasure.
No, I totally get you. But I mean, you did fill the brief well, like gross food, so I think you did great.
Well, thank
Uh,
you. I mean, it's nice to be recognized all these years later. I don't think it won any awards. We did have awards too, and I don't think the llama got much glory. So thank you.
so did you do more of that stuff, like the gross food stuff with Halloween? Maybe you just told me about you went caroling around Christmas.
Mm. Yeah, every
Um,
year we had a little Christmas band, and we would perform in the lobby. Then we would kind of take it on the road and kind of tour the building. And like I said, really, people would just glance up from their work and then go right back to animating. So it was more for us than anybody else. But yeah, that was a fond memory.
oh, that sounds very in Dutch gezellig. By the way, this is something that I was wondering about as I've grown up with all the Disney movies,
Hmm.
and Disney movies were stories or fairy tales told in a certain way, and then at some point they needed to match a culture completely. Like Ron and John went to Hawaii for Moana to get
Hmm.
the whole culture in there.
Hmm.
It's I've wondered, like, I don't know um, if you were aware of this change or if you even recognize what I'm saying. But I have
I
the
do.
feeling it became more complicated.
Yes, I'd love to speak to that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, of course, we want to honor any culture in which our stories are set for authenticity, right? So we would
Mm-hmm.
have teams that would, for Lion King, it was to the savannah, and basically the directors and the art directors and the heads of all the departments would go on field trips and do reconnaissance.
Mm-hmm.
It makes sense. There was no internet back then. So as a background painter, I would literally use the photographs that Doug Ball took on the savannah. And, they visited the Masai Mara and just got to know the
Mm-hmm.
entire culture. Because in addition to the wildlife on the savannah, the music was very much, and even if you look at Just Can't Wait to Be King, it was folk art meets a children's book aesthetic. You got
Mm.
to get to know the regional folk art. And that includes the humans, not just, right, the wildlife on the savannah. So they spent time with the Masai Mara. And yeah, I was not invited on that, but I got to use the pictures in my work. So that is logic, right? You've got to do the reconnaissance, and it's kind of hard to do a
Mm-hmm.
picture if you've never been there. Beyond that, I think what you're
True.
hinting at is we started, and I guess it was early diversity and inclusion and visibility and representation, but of course we started to do films like Mulan, which that was the most well-loved folktale among a pretty big country, right, with a huge population. And so
Mm.
you can't drop the ball on that. You've got to honor it and do it justice. Previous to things like Mulan or even Pocahontas, which is the Native American culture, Disney,
Mm-hmm.
of course, was criticized for being too generic, too homogenous, too white.
Ah.
Absolutely. We whitewashed everything. And if Disney was going to tell a story, of course, it's going to be, let's say we animated the story of Christ, the gospel. He's going to
Mm-hmm.
be blonde with blue eyes, right? And so there was
Yeah.
so much criticism. I do think there was an effort on the part of, who knows, corporate Disney, the higher ups, to start telling other stories from other cultures and represent the marginalized and the
Mm.
disenfranchised and those whose stories have not yet been told in Western Judeo-Christian culture. I don't think Michael Eisner would ever have said it that way, nor would Jeffrey Katzenberg, but that's the truth. Jeffrey Katzenberg doing Prince of Egypt, that was a passion project for him, right? Because of his heritage. But I think
Mm-hmm.
overall, it was the beginning of this movement toward telling untold stories of the silenced and erased. But because Disney was, for so many decades, accused of whitewashing everything and showing
Mm-hmm.
us an idealized version, but maybe a limited version that excludes people, right? They were like, we can't do this wrong. If we do Pocahontas, we got to do our research. If we do Mulan,
Mm-hmm.
we've got to do our research. So in my teaching, I would often show the Mulan style guide and
Mm-hmm.
would have everything from, it was a really, really comprehensive style guide with like, do this, don't do that. And you'd see a big,
Yeah.
the circle with the slash, the anti slash.
Yeah, I love that style guide.
Yeah, it's really almost insulting because it's so like, do this, don't do that. If you're going to punctuate, and so it goes into like yin and yang and the whole cultural concept of the light and the shadow. And you see it everywhere in that film. It would say it's not about balance, but it's about balance with rhythm. It has movement, it's not static. So when you punctuate, I don't know, the Huns, and you've got 90% snow and 10% little Huns coming over the hill, you just
Mm-hmm.
distribute them in a way that incorporates movement. Even the tiles on a roof, the rice paddies the space had to be broken up, yes, according to the golden mean, but with a little
Mm-hmm.
offset that intrigued the eye. So it comes from Chinese letter forms, it comes from Chinese watercolors and woodblock prints. The research is there. And maybe in China they recognize it, but the rest of the world just feels it.
True. Okay.
I think I hit on what you were hinting at, which is there was a lot of responsibility there. If you're going to tell culturally relative stories, or again, the most well loved folktale in Chinese culture, you got
Yeah.
it right.
True, true. I sometimes feel, and maybe that is um depending on how marginalized the culture is.
Mhm,
But for instance, both Lilo and Stitch and Moana or take place in Polynesia or
mhm,
Hawaii.
mhm,
Um, and I have the feeling that Lilo and Stitch might have been, well, as it was a great research trip into how to water paint, how watercolor, and the techniques and get the foliage right,
mhm.
but maybe culturally less, um,
Authentic?
maybe, yeah, could that
I
be?
don't know. I never really thought about it. I've never been to Hawaii, so I wouldn't know. I feel that Moana is authentic when I watch it, but again, I'm the last person to ask. What I do know is,
Mm.
Chris Sanders' thumbprint is all over. One of the rare cases where an amazing director was able to really use his personal style and it transcended it, made it to the screen. He has a love of that culture and frankly island women, and you see it in his personal work. So he's
Yes.
coming from a very authentic place. I will say, like on Mulan, we had Hans Bacher, we had people, Andy Gaskell, we had people with that heritage that were kind of a checks and balance system. I can't speak to Lilo and Stitch because I didn't work on it. Why do you feel it was less than authentic out of curiosity? Was it Disneyfied, in other words?
Maybe authentic is not the word I was looking for. It's more, for some, I feel that there's a very strong wish or will to make it super authentic. And
Mhm,
in the older movies, it could also just be about a story that doesn't necessarily have to be exactly taken place in exactly that spot,
mhm.
generalized, I guess. Um, and I wondered if that whole change in making it super authentic, if that was that necessary, maybe?
Mm.
Sometimes story can also speak for itself.
Here's one response. You can't please all the people all the time. So
True.
what I'm talking about, Disney was damned if they did and damned if they didn't. The
Yeah.
minute I should just say we, the minute we had to branch out and start telling diverse stories, nobody was ever satisfied. I'm talking on Aladdin. If you went 1 millimeter too far in one direction or the other in trying to portray an ethnicity, you got in trouble. You know, I don't know how you
Right.
feel, but you look at Aladdin himself and Jasmine, and you could come up with complaints, but at least the effort was made to nail. And this is a long, long conversation. Again, in my
True.
teaching at Art Center, you get in trouble. You just can't say certain things. So I would do little demonstrations and I would just take a simple happy face. I would move
Mm-hmm.
the eyes out toward the right, the outer periphery of the circle. And
Okay.
and then I would take the other one and I would move them closer together. And I would say, which one is smarter? Of course, everybody, the one with the wider set eyes is seen as intelligent. The one with the closer
Mhm.
set eyes. So there are archetypes, I'm sorry, and there are formal properties that elicit certain responses. Beyond
Mhm.
that, I think, you know, if you really researched Prince of Egypt, problematic to some, just character design to another. But there is a way to
Mm.
portray a Semitic. The spacing and the proportion on the sphere is everything in terms of portraying the Semitic tribes. So,
Okay.
because he's from the culture, Jeffrey Katzenberg, you can get away with it. It's kind of like using the N
Mm.
word. You can use the N word within a culture. I'm part of the
Mm.
LGBTQ community, so I don't mind saying fag or gay or, but do you know what I mean? You don't get to do that if you're not from the culture. So
True.
whatever. But in my teaching, you know, I didn't want to get in trouble, so I was always very careful with my wording. But I would say
Mm.
you can be offended if you want. You know, some people would say you for Japanese, you take the outer corners of the eyes and raise them, and you've got Japanese. You lower them
Mm.
in the other direction, you've got Chinese. It's called
Mm.
character design. So grow up,
That's
be
true.
offended if you want, but this is what we do all day, every day in the trenches of production. It's not sensitive. Nobody walks on eggshells. It's called character design. What did you just
True.
bring out of me?
Well, to be honest, I was gonna go because after, I think it might have been just after you left,
Hmm.
but there was a whole new group. I believe they were called Facebook Moms that made a whole thing out of. So, but how is it then that all the people from non-white cultures are dressed more sluttier, right? Jasmine is
Oh, yes,
sexier,
yes.
and um, and then we have the whole thing where Beauty and the Beast is Stockholm syndrome. It's not, but
No, no,
it feels.
look, of course, we're always evolving and old tropes should be retired. There are many problematic things in the Disney brand, of course. Part of it is
Mm,
Disney is a product of the culture in which it came up. And there's an idealism. There's entire documentaries on the speculated agenda of Walt himself, right? There are propaganda films that
mhm,
were done. You've probably seen them. So
maybe.
there's, but I think we always need to parse between complete conspiracy theory, like Walt's head is in a vault somewhere, frozen, and the
I didn't
reality.
know that one.
Yeah, it's definitely in a vault. So there's always going to be the full gamut of conspiracy theory to really problematic tropes like Song of the South. There's a good reason it's no
Mm,
longer in distribution. Those are outdated tropes that do not fly today. So don't, you know, mishear what I'm saying. I think Disney's as guilty as everybody else of limiting tropes. Did you happen to
mm.
see the Netflix series Hollywood?
No, I don't think so. I'll write it down.
Well, there's a trend right now toward, I call it aspirational storytelling. So there's
Okay.
whitewashing. It's probably going on in America more than you're aware. But this idea of cleansing the past. Do we tear down the statues of people who turned out, oh, oops, he was a slave owner. Why are we celebrating this person with a statue? So
Mm,
you take the good with the bad, and I say you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. But it is a culture of canceling. You've heard cancel culture, right? You've heard
mhm.
whitewashing, you've heard revisionist history. This is a big topic. And Disney is just as guilty as everybody else under the guise of idealism, actually. So
Yeah.
conservatism, not that I'm ever going to defend it, but conservatism is sometimes founded in idealism. So, again, in the spirit of this podcast, as we touched on a little bit in the pre interview, aspiration
Mhm.
storytelling does create tropes It normalizes things, right? It creates a
Mm-hmm.
model that we can aspire to, but never at the expense of the silenced and erased, if that makes sense. I'm not exonerating Disney for problematic tropes like Song of the South, but they are a product of the culture in which they arose. So
Yeah.
I do think people have a lot of time on their hands. Those mothers you're talking about are not wrong. That series, Hollywood, that I mentioned, you're going to
Mm-hmm.
see, I'm not going to get her name right, but Anna May Wong, I think is her name, the woman who
Okay.
lost out on an Oscar because it was given to a white woman. Basically, it's the equivalent of blackface, but she was playing an Oriental, they would have said back then, using makeup. Mickey Rooney. Did you ever see Breakfast at Tiffany's?
Yes, I did.
You could never do that now. Dustin Hoffman playing a Native American with red face. Like you would never get away with that now. And that's called progress. So when
True.
you look at Jasmine and you go, why is she dressed sluttier? Because of the entire history of that. The Oriental had to be the Dragon Lady, the
Hmm.
femme fatale. It had its own twist to it, but the Oriental was always sexualized and seductive. And I'm using
Mm.
the word Oriental facetiously. You get what I'm saying? So Disney's not exempt, and that's what they were trying to correct, actually, and making an extra effort to portray the ethnicities in Aladdin without offending anyone. You're never going to please all the people all the time.
True. And do you also agree with the storytelling? What's the word? Facebook mom theories, the Stockholm syndrome, the that what's the word? Ariel losing her voice for her. Oh yeah, being silenced for a guy.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, to be honest, I think if you watch the movies, um, all these things are mitigated already. The story is on their own. Like for instance, Ariel the Little Mermaid. I
Mhm.
don't think she gets silenced for a guy. I think it's a story about Ursula and Triton that have a whole big battle, and they have the character arcs.
Mhm.
And then it's told from the point of view of Ariel,
Mhm.
who just really wanted to be a human all along, and then Eric comes by.
Mhm.
So it was never for just a guy. It was she
Well,
loves human stuff, right? That was her already.
mhm.
And with Beauty and the Beast, I think Belle is very vocal and clear about that she is not free and that she is not Stockholm at all, Stockholm syndrome.
Mhm.
Um, but now we have all these remakes that overly
Mm.
compensate all those
Mhm.
Facebook mom theories,
Right, right.
and now the stories sort of get messed up. Like uh, Belle now falls in love with, well, quite a dick of a person who's not very nice. And
Okay,
this
I'm
is
gonna jump
now,
in
yeah, yes,
because
jump in.
you asked me. So,
Yeah.
well, in the spirit of this podcast, there's some valid conversations here, but
Mm-hmm.
pretty big and pretty nuanced. What I
True.
relate to and what you just said is, for example, yes, I think the most egregious thing Disney has perpetuated, the most egregious trope that Disney has perpetuated with regard to the Disney princesses, is that you're waiting for the prince to come along on a white horse and rescue you.
Yeah.
Right. And so female characters were never empowered. They were never complete on their own. Right. And you could analyze the tropes or the archetypes in all of these supposedly universal stories and find them problematic. And so, yes, you suddenly had Mulan, who was a powerful female character with agency. And so we
Mm-hmm.
are always trying to correct. We're always trying to create what I was hinting at earlier and never fully got into, this idea of aspirational storytelling. When
Mm-hmm.
you whitewash and revise history, it's actually irresponsible. So another example I've given, and we had a Harvard literature professor on, and we went a little more into this, but
Mm-hmm.
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Did you happen to see that?
I've seen it, yes. Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah. So Tarantino is really good at mimicking genres, whether it's the grindhouse films or black exploitation. He's really good at mimicking genres, and they seem actually very authentic to the time period. But he also is really good at wish fulfillment in kind of a
Mm.
sophomoric way. So Django Unchained would be like, ooh, the revenge fantasy. And it's kind of the same with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's a revenge fantasy, a what if, which is a little,
Mhm.
in my opinion, just my opinion, a little adolescent and sophomoric. What if? And so I'm watching it going, ooh, it's kind of sacred territory. I mean, Sharon Tate was murdered with a baby in her belly. Do we get to retell that story or should we honor it and keep it as is? You know, when
Mm.
you get into the Holocaust, I love springtime and Hitler for Germany. Like when somebody that was directly affected by that intergenerational trauma makes Hitler look like an asshole, I love it. It's very cathartic. But when somebody misappropriates in out of
Mhm.
ignorance, it's problematic. So I
Yeah.
love Quentin Tarantino, but I find him hit and miss. I love
Mm.
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood because it's the world into which I was born. I'm nostalgic about that time
Mm.
period. I literally live a block away from the La Bianca house where the Manson murders took place. It's part of my Southern California upbringing. I loved watching that film. It was uncomfortable for me because when you start to rewrite history in an aspirational way, even if it's a
Mm.
revenge fantasy, it just feels irresponsible. I couldn't see Inglorious Bastards because I thought it's too sacred. We need to
Mm.
reserve the power of those images for what we were talking about earlier, which is God forbid we forget the horrors of the past lest they repeat themselves. So I'm talking
Yeah.
in real general terms. But if we go back to that Disney princess waiting to be rescued, thank God we're starting to tell the Mulan stories. And I happen to think like Frozen, that's a really strong female protagonist. I think we're
Mm.
seeing the evening of the playing field, aren't we? In every way.
Sure.
So
Sure.
I
I
don't know what
mean,
more people want. You know, I think it's the
ah,
culture we live in. You look back and you gotcha. I call it a gotcha society. You look back
oh.
and you know there's all kinds of problematic things. Pick any
Mm.
snippet from Dick Cavett in the 60s, you're going to find things that don't fly today. Just let it go. Say it's a product of its era. Thank God we've made progress. Let's move forward and not keep canceling people by going back in history and catching them just speaking the lingo. Okay, as an LGBTQ individual, I was born in 68. I grew up during the height of the sexual revolution. What could be better than that? I grew up knowing San Francisco was the Mecca where all the gays went. I saw Anita Bryant in the news and all the legislation about being gay was still on the APA books as a psychological disorder. You could be fired from any job for being gay.
Mm.
I'm sorry, history is not what it seems when you look back. Yes, the height of the sexual revolution, but a lot of work left to be done. I don't know what
Sure.
my point is, other than my mom was as good as it gets. She went to cosmetology school. She was surrounded by homos. She made sure to expose us to aging by taking us to, you know, a convalescent home where a family friend Mabel was. She made sure
Mhm.
we knew all her gay friends, but you know what? Wasn't talked about. God forbid you say the word. So what does a kid
Well,
do
yeah.
with all that? It says more, the silence speaks louder than words. So it goes on and on. Even
Mm.
my mom, as good as it gets, she would have been a hippie if she didn't start having kids and they just
Mhm.
started becoming more conservative because they were a family, but she's a hippie. She did
Mhm.
pottery and macrame and but even her, like in the mid 70s, God love her.
Mhm.
David Bowie came on TV with, you know, heterochromia, two different colored eyes, and his hair spiked up and probably very, now we would say non binary, but he was very androgynous back then.
Mm.
And, you know, out of her mouth comes, ooh, that's every mother's nightmare of a gay son. She's as
Wow.
good as it gets. But
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
taking
Yeah.
notes going, okay, well, that's how moms feel about gay kids. Okay, noted. So
Mm.
I do not judge my mom for that. Of course I don't. It was the 70s. We weren't there yet, and we're still not there. How could you judge my mom for just reflecting the world in which we lived?
To be honest, I didn't.
No, but you get what
But
I'm
it
saying,
is.
right?
Yeah. No. No. Definitely. Definitely.
So I
But
feel
that
that way
must be
about
so
Disney. Like,
weird.
if you have a lot of time on your hands, you're going to
Yeah.
parse and find everything we did wrong. Granted, it was an
Right.
aspirational form of idealistic storytelling that you could label as conservative. But you know what?
Mm.
Disney was the first one to offer domestic partner benefits to gay couples long before anybody else. So, on that front, I did hint at this before. When I started at Disney, it was at a moment in time where, yes, Disney was offering domestic partner benefits for same sex couples. No corporation had ever done that. So the Southern Baptists were up in arms and they actually boycotted all things Disney, the parks, the movies, the merchandising, all of it. I
Right.
mentioned my
Yeah.
brother in law, a minister at the time, pretty conservative, wrote an entire article, I think in the LA Times, saying, "You guys are cutting off your nose to spite your face. Take
Mm.
good entertainment where you can get it." He went
Yeah.
classic by classic and pointed out how Disney is the gospel. All,
Right.
all of the main themes and all of the Disney classics supported the gospel. So what you kind of hinted at this earlier, the main themes meant to be imparted in some of these age-old folk tales, right? Some of the
Mm.
archetypes have a message, but if you get hung up on details, you're not going to receive the universal message. So I don't know, Beauty and the Beast, people miss the mark. Isn't it about redeeming
Yeah.
ourselves internally? You have to look at every character as an aspect of the same psyche. So we all
Right.
have a pure entity. Our essence is pure. We all become the beast through ego that we build up
Mm.
through life experience, right? And so, how do we
Right.
redeem ourselves? I think the most problematic trope in many of the Disney films, but films in general, is this archetype that you need to, even if it takes tricking somebody into loving you, you're only redeemed if you can get people to love you. You know what? The truth is,
Yeah.
love is a verb. The truth is, actively loving others instead of seeking to be loved, that is where redemption lies. So there's a movie called Marvin's Room, which is I highly recommend to everybody.
Mm.
And it's about, did you ever see Marvin's Room?
No, I don't think so, but I'm writing it down.
It's Meryl Streep and somebody. And basically, it's about the one daughter that goes off and establishes a career, and she's kind of vain, self absorbed,
Mm.
selfish, seemingly, right? Really into
Mm.
her own career. And the other one stays home and takes care of the aging parents. I'm kind of going to get it wrong, but at the climax of the film, the one that went off and had her career and self indulged had to come home and really saw, wow, my sister has sacrificed for our aging parents and everything she gave up. But she also
Mhm.
saw so much love there. I'm going to get it wrong, but she said something like, wow, you have so much love. And I think it was the Meryl Streep character said, well, yeah, I'm very lucky. And she said, yes, they love you so much. And she goes, no, 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 I'm lucky because I get to love them.
Mm.
So to me, the most problematic tropes in some of these Disney films is a lot of them hinge on you redeem yourself by tricking somebody into loving you or
Yeah.
kissing you. And then you wake up, right? You wake up if you get kissed by that prince. That is all a metaphor for spiritual awakening. But you
Mm.
know what? Let's shift that paradigm.
Right.
Let's retire that trope and let's talk about serving. Let's talk about actively loving others in order to redeem ourselves. People get hung up.
Mm.
I mean, how could you expect the public to understand liturgy or literary criticism? They don't know that it's a very universal parable about our psyches, our souls. Don't get hung
Mm.
up on the details.
No. If you do that, I mean, if you wanna see wrong, you will see wrong. So
Right. Same thing with the article my brother-in-law wrote. I did think at some point, like, if you find problematic things about these films, you're really trying hard. You have to try really hard to hate a Disney.
yeah,
You just have no
exactly.
joy at that point. You have no capacity for joy.
Well, I mean, apparently this came from a concern, that girls stay in the Wendy phase for too
Mm.
long since, we had sort of gender-coded jobs, like girls do more of caretaking, guys do more of construction, and if our girls didn't, stay in the Wendy phase for too long because of Disney,
Mhm, mhm.
then they would be construction builders or some I don't know how they figured this, but, there was something like that, so they would
It's
take
totally valid. This is how we progress. This is the whole premise of our podcast. The stories we tell,
Mm,
whether it's on the micro or the macro, we are a product of the stories we're exposed to. How could it not be? We're socially conditioned, we're socialized through storytelling and nothing else.
Mm,
Didactic persuasion only goes so
mm.
far. People dig their heels in when you try to persuade them. They fall back on cherry picking and identity politics. That's called pride and ego. Storytelling changes minds by touching hearts. It's chemical, and I don't repeat my entire book or the entire premise of the talk. But this is why we do the podcast. An awareness that we transform only through storytelling. It's not just emotional catharsis, it's the shifting of paradigms intellectually. This is what the podcast is about. Thank God for those mothers who are up in arms about it and want to start telling new stories. This is how this
Mm.
works. All I was saying a moment ago is like, let's not get hung up on the past. Let's move forward. And thank God for groups like that. We're always assessing, right, the stories that are shaping our future. I watch Netflix. Seriously, I was without streaming for a long time. And I
Mm.
jokingly would say, I can't live on planet Earth because I can't talk about vampires or dragons or drug runners. Like I felt like I couldn't hold a conversation. So then when I finally got Netflix, actually in the hospital, my sister left her laptop. So I had 18 days to catch up on Santa. I don't know why I started with Santa Clarita Diet. Did you ever see that?
Yeah, no, I did, but I thought
I
you were
loved
gonna
it.
go like,
No, I don't know why I started with that one, but
it's
I
funny.
loved it. But over time, I very much started to think, wow, this isn't art. Writing for streaming, writing an episodic series with a cliffhanger, with that dopamine rush,
Mm.
gong, gong, it gets you to come back. So addictive. But I actually started respecting the writing, thinking, wow, it's
Mm.
not art, but it is genius. Then, after too much of it, I started thinking, wow, Netflix really has a brand. And you know what? It's depressing. Like
Oh God.
everything is in that uncanny valley of kind of surreal, and nobody really
Mm.
acts like that. So I love Ryan Murphy to death. But when I OD'd on Ryan Murphy, I thought, you know what? He does not know how human behavior works. He's like on the spectrum. And this is so surreal, and the performances are not naturalistic at all. This is not how humans work. It's one brand. But why is it becoming Netflix entire brand? I'm kind of going all over the place here, but here's what I came to. I started feeling like, wow, my screenplays um, are not clever enough. They don't have those cliffhangers under the
Oh.
guise of being nonlinear and experimental and art films.
Mhm.
Nobody's going to recognize the value of that. There's no
No.
currency at this moment. I'm exaggerating. But other than little independent films, foreign films, low budget films, and the Lemleys only, the public has zero appetite for what we used to call art or poetry or nonlinear storytelling or experimental. I'm putting it in extremes. But
Mhm.
thanks to Netflix and other things like that, everybody has lost their gauge, right? We're doom scrolling all day, every day, and we've got cultural ADD. Nobody recognizes art except in elitist circles. So we're
Hmm.
training the mainstream to just keep scrolling. If it's not tits and ass, now I'm really preaching. But one of my favorite filmmakers, I think it was Quaron, did a film on HDTV, which he had never done. He had always done 35 millimeter high production values. He, I think, not sold out, but you adapt or die. He allowed it to be a
Mhm.
hybrid release. So for the first time, he's picturing people watching his film. I think it was Roma. It was like mid pandemic. And he knew
Okay.
full well people are going to be filing their nails and making out their shopping list and kind of paying attention, but kind of not while watching his film. It was sad for me to hear him say, oh no, this is the new landscape. I'm excited about it. I thought,
Oh.
you talked yourself into that, but no, you're better than that. I heard somebody, it might have been Quentin Tarantino, said, yeah, I'm kind of done. I'm retiring because I don't know what a good story is anymore. He had lost
Mm.
his own gauge, and that's how I feel. If my what I have to say has zero currency and it would not be recognized, what is the point? If it doesn't have the
Mm.
tits and ass, or you know what I mean, or the titillation, it's simply not going to be recognized. I joke like on my Instagram, I originally got it because I thought it had the cool filters. And then I realized,
Mm.
oh, that's Snapchat. The filters were
Oh.
really limited on Instagram. But then I had no brand. I wasn't trying to build a platform or trying to get likes or get followers. I wasn't. I was just having fun on my dog walks, taking pictures of succulents in my neighborhood, and for my own
Mm.
benefit. So I would jokingly say, I'm trying to bore my 5 followers as much as possible. And in my
Okay.
filmmaking, I do try to suspend a moment. And it's very cinema verite. It's very nouvelle vague. It's very 60s to like take a one shot that actually may or may not propel the plot or develop the characters, but it kind of puts you in a space, right? It puts you in the moment. And I like to suspend moments because I'm not going to contribute to cultural ADD.
Mm.
I do think we know what constitutes entertainment value now. There's a cinema verite film, I'm not going to remember which one, but it's just a guy crossing a courtyard. I think he's carrying a plant. It takes him 10 minutes to cross the effing courtyard. That did not propel the plot. So we've gotten smarter about what does propel the story and actually will keep butts in the seats, what constitutes entertainment value. But there is
Mm.
something, I'm going to steer this back to Disney actually. There
Oh.
still is something to be said for creating the texture, the ambiance, for transporting people into a space, right? So if you
Mm.
look at Princess and the Frog, did you see that?
Oh my God, yes, so many times.
Okay, so the trend now is again, if it doesn't directly contribute to the character development or the escalation of the plot, no room for it. But you may have noticed that was a little bit of a return to the old school feeling. If you watch Pinocchio, for no reason at all, we're
Yeah.
going to break into a song and just ignite the imaginations of children and take them on a ride. That had
Mm.
value in and of itself. So I think we've leaned too far, and Disney is known for formula, right? When Howard Ashman and Alan Menken came along and we started really perfecting the musical theater as animated film, it became a
Yeah.
formula for good or bad. And within the industry, you've probably heard this. We talk about the want song. The want
Yes.
and the need are integral to not just Western storytelling structure, but to screenwriting. The want in the want and need, that became a song. So when Belle sits on a trunk and talks about the great wide open, that's her want. When the Little
Mm.
Mermaid says, I want to be part of their world, that's
Mm.
the want song. So it went a little too far in terms of formula. But I think Princess and the Frog was a return not just to the nostalgia of sort of the badgering technique, those soft backgrounds with the vignetted edges that almost looks cigar
Mm.
burned, and that kind of, we call it the pool of light that feels like a children's book. But it was a return to the nonlinear storytelling where you get to depart and take people on a ride and ignite their, especially children, ignite their imaginations in a way that may or may not contribute to the escalation of the plot or the character development. I love that film.
Yeah, yeah, me too. And I love the music in it. I'm so in love with the music in it.
How well
Yeah.
did it do at the box office?
It didn't do so well.
That's right.
Um,
Unfortunately.
yeah, that's was it because it was 2D? Because people think that that's for children?
Well, let me tell you a little story. I had a friend that's literally a TD, technical director. He's a techie. We call
Mm.
it IT, right?
Mm.
Information technologies. Not in the entertainment industry, but he's no dummy. Let's put it that way. He's an IT. We
Okay.
came out of Madagascar. One of the first, like the first Madagascar. And I, being who I am, I just said, yeah, I liked it, but man, those character designs were kind of all over the place. You know, it seemed like there was no real art direction. No offense to anyone, but I felt like there was
Mm.
a broad range of character designs, and they all felt like they came from it in terms of shape orientation. Of course, that meant nothing to him. When I said the word
Mm.
model, you know, like, oh, there were sharp edges in the models. I liked that. He goes, the what? I said, well, you know, that was all the characters were modeled in three-dimensional, right? In Maya, or it wasn't Maya, whatever it was back then. He had
Mm.
no idea what I was talking about. So it's story that matters. I'm going to tell another
True.
story. The public
Okay.
really didn't know. Maybe they're getting smarter. They didn't know. They know what they're comfortable seeing. So, for example, I was brought in to Disney Publishing to really help them by talking about the staging that we do in feature animation, a little bit about how we think in feature animation in terms of best supporting the storytelling. Their books were not being approved. So for whatever
Mm.
reason, at the time it was the Up book and the Toy Story book and one other, and they just weren't getting approved. So they wanted me to come in and talk about the staging we incorporate in our films. I really enjoyed doing this visiting artist workshop. I also did
Mhm.
some freelance where I just kind of worked back into some of their illustrations, and magically they suddenly got approved. And it had to do with staging. I won't go on and on, but kind of the pool of light we talked about, or the path of
Mhm.
action, developing your value structure so that you can find. In one case, it was, I think, Woody pointing out to the lawn, and then you see Buzz Lightyear out on the lawn, but you couldn't even find them in all the chaos because there was no cohesive value structure that organized the information, and you couldn't see the hand,
Mhm.
nor could you see Buzz Lightyear on the lawn. So a lot of it was
Yeah.
technical stuff. But in all of
Okay.
it, at that moment, they were rendering the children's books with full modeling, just like a screenshot from, right, a CG film. And I said,
Whoa.
why would you do that? Like, why? Traditionally, the children's book field, it was always tactile. You felt like you could reach out and touch the coarse watercolor paper or see the
Mhm.
granularity of the pigment settling into that. It was very tactile. Nothing digital flew. I used to go to a Society of Children's Book Writers every year and see what was being put out by every imprint of every publisher in the children's book or the picture book arena. It was
Mhm.
always tactile. It took a long time for even Photoshop or vector based imagery to be acceptable in children's books. So here I am at Disney Publishing looking at their current line, right, from their imprint, modeled dimensionally just like screenshots from the film. I said, why do you do that? They said, oh, because that's what children expect to see.
They do?
Well, yeah, the books would only sell if they were modeled just like what they know from the film. Instead of creating
Oh.
a whole new experience in the literary realm where it's a version of the story they know so well, it had to be familiar to them. So yeah, we're
Mm.
catering to that instead of challenging. That's another way to look at it, right? We're just catering to it, the status quo, instead of challenging. Where does the next generation of genius come from if we just deliver what we think is going to make, again, bank at the box office or the almighty dollar by making the bestseller list?
Interesting. For sure. To be honest, when you just told me that children want to have the same as they saw in the movie,
Mhm.
um, when I was little and I saw The Little Mermaid, I was sold, of course, and I
Mhm.
had this little cassette tape that played the whole story,
Mhm.
and I have listened to that thing on repeat, I think. And I know for sure that if the story would have been different from what I've seen, like
Right.
My Mermaid, right?
Mhm.
I don't think I would have liked it, probably.
Exactly. Yeah.
I feel
Well,
bad now.
but the thing is, we just sought to tell a good story in feature animation. How they then marketed it was up to marketing. I joke, like with Hunchback, how are you going to market a film where there's no real cuddly plush toy? You going to take
Ah.
the gargoyles? Yep, they took the gargoyles. Are you going to take Quasimodo and put some jelly in the hump like a Stretch Armstrong? They played hell, and they actually did not market the film we made. They marketed less edgy, right, less dark film,
Yeah.
and that's what they needed to do. So I don't think Disney
Mm,
is the prime example of challenging and forging new ground. It is a machine with stockholders to please. There always has to be
true.
a way to honor the Disney legacy while hopefully pushing the envelope in terms of experimental storytelling or even artistry. But it is what it
Mm,
is. I want to go back to this conversation about just continuing to deliver what's familiar for the almighty dollar. At Art Center, for example, it's a cash cow, it's a machine. And for
mhm,
a long time, I would defend it. You'd hear, oh, Art Center has a brand. And I would say, there's
mhm,
nepotism. Like people know what they're going to get. An art director knows what they're going to get if they hire a newly graduated Art Center student. It's called a legacy. They know they're going to get efficiency, they're going to get professional results. Do you know what I mean? That's not bad or wrong.
mhm.
But
No.
separate from that, there was a look always in the gallery. In the 80s, it was Matt Mahurin, Greg Spolenka, Arisman. It was very much spill your coffee on your illustration, drive over it with your truck. It was very layered and tactile. And that was typical of conceptual editorial illustration at that moment. It came from
Mm,
Art Center and made a splash in New York. So that's what every piece in the gallery reflected was the brand. And then it
Mm.
evolves. But you end up with instructors who have minions. And I went to one outdoor plein air painting evening in Pasadena in kind of the dark, uh, brick laden alleys of Pasadena. And I saw literally people who look to the instructor and see how they're holding their brush. They would
Mm.
literally put brushes in their mouth, and I won't name names, but they would put brushes in their mouth and hold them in their mouth just like the instructor. They would take 20 minutes to take a stroke, and they would look at him and make sure they were literally mimicking his strokes. And so you do
Mm.
have minions and you have some pride, and people want to see themselves reflected in the gallery. So the
Mm.
instructors would pick minions and submit the work to the gallery to cement their own legacy. It's all pride
Mm.
based. But at one point, a lot of us agreed, well, where does the next generation of genius come from if everybody's just thinking? And my students, I was on scholarship committee every term, and I would see my students, instead of expressing their own voices, they would conform to the look in the gallery because they knew
Mm.
that's how they would get their scholarship.
Yeah.
And so we had to push back against that and go, yeah, we need to leave room for the new voices that don't conform because that's the next generation of genius. So in film, one
Mm.
example, I took a Loch Ness CG feature that I had written. And at the
Mm.
moment, you didn't have a treatment in anime, or you certainly didn't have a screenplay. You had a treatment that was prose. And you can Google them. Anyone that's listening can go online and see the Lion King treatment as it originally was written, and then as it evolved with the visual development and the story development. The treatment gets revisited, but it's certainly
Mm.
not in screenplay format. Anyway, I chose to write a screenplay for my CG feature. I was working
Mm.
with the creative exec at Buena Vista, another tangent, but I kind of was a finalist in this, the ABC DGA Film Fellowship. So one of the
Mm.
perks was I got to work with a creative executive. And he said, actually, at Buena Vista Pictures, we're going down that road. We're actually starting to conceive CG films with an intact screenplay. It was perfect timing on my part. So, anyway, I had an agent at the time. He was also the lawyer for Toons India. So he had access to a lot of production facilities that could champion it. And anyway, so we started pitching it around. And I think it was New Line Cinema, which used to be Orion. I don't remember which acquisitions person it was, but we got to know. But the guy was, nice enough, in quotes, to give us feedback. And he said,
Mm.
well, it's uncomfortable that the protagonist grows up. We need to keep our G audience by keeping the protagonist identifiable, meaning in the same age range. And I didn't say
Mm.
it in the meeting because I didn't want to defend, but I told my lawyer later, like, wait a minute. When I was a kid, I couldn't wait to be my older brothers and sisters. You aspired to be cool and older, so I
Yeah.
don't buy that. But more than that, I said, okay, there was Bambi, in which there's a montage, in which Bambi grows up. There is
Mm.
a Lion King montage in which Simba grows up. I started
Mm.
rattling off all the films in which it's a coming of age story. Why would you not show the character growing up? It hinges on that. The answer was those are 2D films and it was over 5 minutes ago. So
Oh,
never mind universal templates for storytelling, right? Never mind the
no.
Shakespearean templates. Never mind the Greek tragedies and this
It's
whole.
Aristotle.
Nope, it was over 5 minutes ago. It's not what kids are used to seeing. So they go with the
Ah.
trends again instead of thinking about the future. Where does the next form of storytelling come from?
Mm. Interesting. So, since you are all over story, you have been since, well, basically your whole life.
Since I
Um,
got that typewriter at
I was just
how
gonna say, yes, this is a typewriter.
I certainly
At
had a
night.
love of it. I don't know if I was a born storyteller, but like you, I had a love of it, right? Love.
Well, but you seem to talk about it a little differently than I have ever thought about it. So, what I was wondering about is that you told me that in the Disney studios, you apparently got to hang or hear or see how the stories were made with Jeffrey Katzenberg with the board.
Right.
Um, and I was wondering, who were you that you were allowed to be there, or was just everybody there? Like, how did you? What I know
I,
different times, but how did this come to be?
well, I was just a peon to answer your question. I was a 20-year-old trainee. You're not wrong. I was just a new kid on the block. But yeah,
Mm,
the answer is Lion King was a tiny production. Everybody was on Aladdin already, and we were
mm,
in that. I think it was 1420 Flower initially, but tiny crew, and so they just gathered everybody around in this warehouse building when Elton John came to pitch the songs. And
mm,
I don't know. I was lucky. It was a tiny crew, and I think for that, people came from the other buildings, from Aladdin, from all the other, not all the other, but
mm,
the one other production, and that was more of an event. But basically, it was just a tiny crew. So when this is something the public may not know, but the entire film is not greenlit at one moment. For good or bad,
mm.
it seems counterintuitive to me, but one act can be greenlit and you just start working on production with
Yeah,
2 and Act 3 still being a mystery and being subject to market research and test
yeah.
screenings and all of that. It's approved act at a time. So from that point on, basically every sequence, and again, terminology for listeners, we use the word scene a lot when referring to stage plays and films. But a scene in animation is what we think of as a shot in live action film. So there's scenes,
Mm,
sequences, and acts. Every act is broken down into a sequence, which is then broken down into a scene. And in
mm,
animation, a scene is the equivalent of a shot. It doesn't matter. It's just how we label, the layout packets and actually track the production. But
right.
anyway, every sequence, let's call it, whether it's an action adventure sequence or a romance sequence or kind of exposition, world building, whatever it
Mm,
is, it's of course boarded by an individual. There's a supervisor to the story department that
mm-hmm.
largely answers to the director. But anyway, it's actually I like to say, in animation, the lead animator keeps the juiciest scenes for themselves and then delegates the boring ones to everybody else. I'm sure it's the same in story. Point being, there every single panel of that storyboard is pinned back in the day, pinned to a corkboard, and then they
Mm,
actually have to pitch it to Jeffrey Katzenberg. Sometimes it's Michael Eisner, whoever the powers that be are at that moment. You have to be a little bit of an actor because you get out that pointer, you walk them through it,
mm.
you sell them on it. So even in my teaching, if I had a really interior artist, and a lot of artists can be, right, very awkward, social,
Introverted.
right, introverted, I'd say you gotta be a little bit of a performer if you want to be a story artist. And I prepare them for
Mm,
that. Anyway, how did I get to sit in on them? Well, it was a tiny production. So I did hear
mm.
every single pitch of every board on Lion King to Jeffrey Katzenberg at the time. And I heard every bit of feedback he disseminated. So that is largely where I learned my Western storytelling structure. And then later, working with a creative exec on one of my own pitches. Have you heard about the Gong Show?
I have.
Yeah,
This is where the Little Mermaid came up.
right. And Pocahontas. Have you heard that kind of myth?
No, not no. Tell me about
Well, I've
Pocahontas.
never heard. We're kind of jumping all over, but I never heard Michael Gabriel say it himself. But the lore is Pocahontas evolved, of course, but it started out with literally just a stunning piece of artwork and the title, Pocahontas. Very little
Mm,
else. And yes, that was at a Gong Show. So
mm.
about 8 years in, I realized, wow, I've never done the Gong Show. I should. I've got ideas, and
Oh.
so I put a pitch together. And they have you work with a creative executive for about a week. And ostensibly, it's so that you don't waste Tom and Peter's time. That was our president and vice president at
Mm,
the time. So they just coach you on your pitch. And yeah, I learned a lot there too, listening to the feedback from Tom and Peter on some of the pitches. And I did carry that forward later when I started writing my own screenplays and directing as an auteur. And then, of course, there's different rules in the literary realm, but it was kind of a steady arc of learning the Western storytelling structure. That I don't want to get technical, but the want and the need and how that results in the
mhm,
main theme. And this, everybody knows, we all learned it in elementary school, the overall story arc. So a
mm,
character arc is very different than the overall story arc. I guess I'm going into it a little bit, but the character arc
mhm,
is they start out blank and they end up blank, right? They start out
mhm,
ignorant, they end up enlightened. They start out prejudiced, they end up tolerant. That's the character arc. The overall
Mm,
story arc is the one we all recognize: the inciting incident, the escalation of the conflict, or some call it rising action, the
mm-hmm.
climax, then the denouement, or the falling. You hear all these different interchangeable terms: the falling action, or the resolution, or the denouement. Everybody knows that from elementary school. But anyway, it really got ingrained in me, and I carried it forward, and I very much value that.
So you got to be present. You were, sorry, the thing that I cannot really fathom is that apparently you say it's a small production, and sure, The Lion King must have been, but um, still, that you as a background painter uh, were there and got to see the story um, with the cork and the story beat and
The pitch, yeah.
the pitch.
Hmm.
And then you also got to be at the Gong Show.
Hmm.
Um, it sounds so free. It sounds so the sky's the limit type deal.
Well,
I don't know
it
if
sounds
it
like you're
was.
you're referring a little bit to like a hierarchy. Like,
Maybe.
it was very democratic. I mean, nobody was better than anybody else. And one way of putting that is like, I am spoiled. Again, I've hinted last in the last episode, very
Yeah.
different cultures in TV animation, very different cultures at different studios. I was spoiled because yes, you felt respected. You didn't feel there was a hierarchy. And it was just everybody was nice to each other, not in a phony way, just nice all the time because we were in
Mm,
heaven. We were in heaven, surrounded by
that is
amazing
super
artists that
nice.
we respected and worked on films we were proud of. But on a maybe slightly more negative note, like it was politics, right? And everybody was being diplomatic because on one film, you're working alongside a fellow background painter. They could be your
Mm-hmm.
supervisor on the next film.
Ah,
That's a really good
okay.
reason to be on your best behavior right there. So
Yes.
that's the truth. One person could suddenly become your art director or your director. Most directors come out of the story department, and art directors tend to come out of the background department. But yeah, there was no
Mm.
hierarchy. Again, your fellow background painter could be your supervisor on your next film.
So that's a little different now, right?
Well, I don't know. It makes for a really interesting form of politics, but it makes for a very pleasant workplace. I do think it changed. I mean, one thing I will say is a friend died, actually a roommate who was a part of not the IT, but the operations department at Disney. I went back for his services, and yeah, it was a very different climate. And it was very
Mm.
soon after John Lasseter took over. Do you remember when John Lasseter became head of all creative, they called it, at Disney?
Um, n- no.
There was a myth that, oh, he's so open to everybody can pitch. I don't know if you remember that, but more democratic than ever. He's very open to ideas, very open to pitches. I went back and it just felt so different than my days at Disney. Nobody held the door open for you, no eye contact, no hello or goodbye. It actually seemed like everyone was terrorized. They were fearful for their jobs.
Oh,
The
wow.
climate has changed. So you were referring to the Gong Show, I think, or the democratic feeling that there was no hierarchy. And then you said, has that changed? I don't know. I've only gotten glimpses when I go in for things like that.
Mm.
I do know it wasn't the Disney that I'm nostalgic about. It's maybe it is the litigious nature and the fact that HR plays a bigger role and just the world has changed. But everybody seemed scared when I went
Oh, that's so interesting.
back.
Okay.
Make of it what you will. The world has
Let's
changed.
let's stay in the happy Renaissance
Right,
phase,
right,
right?
right.
So with all your democratic involvement, the hard work you put in, then came the fun stuff like the rep parties, right? So
Absolutely.
how were those, and what was the most fun one?
Well, one story, the Central. Have you ever heard about the Pocahontas opening in Central Park?
No, only a little bit from you, but so please give me the whole story.
Well, it was the first time Central Park, from what I understand, may or may not be true, but the lore is such that it was the first time New Yorkers had ever had their park closed by a mouse, right? So Disney has the power to shut down Central Park, and they actually stacked a couple railway cars and draped linen over it to create the screen. So it was a very
Huh.
fun kind of communal experience in theory, just a bunch of people watching magic in the middle of Central Park. Sadly, it rained the minute the film started. But that, so I brought my parents actually. My mom had never been to New York, and I brought them, and then we picked up a cousin of mine from Jersey, and yeah, that was pretty memorable. But I think the story you were prompting here is I did bring my cousin Veronica. I'll give her a shout out
Mm.
from Joycey. She's a California girl, but she really settled into the Joycey thing, and her hair got bigger over, the 2 decades I hadn't seen her actually. So just think,
Huh.
no offense to anyone, but think the nanny, whatever that is. And
Okay.
so she didn't get out much. So I brought her through the Lincoln Tunnel to go to the dinner at the Rainbow Room. So again, it's not just the premiere, there's a whole weekend around it. And the same was true of the Hunchback premiere in New Orleans. There were a lot of events surrounding it, so it became a full weekend. Anyway, so I brought her to, and the Rainbow Room, by the way, for those who don't know, it's in 30 Rock. Some of you might have seen 30 Rock, the series. It's an NBC, mostly NBC building with the Ed Sullivan Theater, I believe, and a lot of iconic things where a lot of very, famous things were shot. But it's also kind of frou-frou. Disney was very down to earth. We were behind the camera, so nothing was particularly glamorous, but they did try to make these events special. So we had an evening dinner in the Rainbow Room, left my parents in the hotel, and brought my cousin as my date. And it was buffet style, very high end, but still a buffet. And my cousin filled her plate and plops down next to Royo Disney and Patty, not
Mm.
having any idea who they were. And he doesn't have a lot of power in the corporation. He kind of fights for the Disney legacy in some ways, even in the climate of, um, Mike Leisner. He really represented the old school and the old legacy of Disney and had some power. He could pull strings and kind of cut through red tape, but he wasn't that involved creatively. But he was really the remaining family member of the Disney legacy. Anyway, she had no
Mm.
idea who he was, so she plops down, and all the tables were filling up, so it was logic. But anyway, I sat down next to her, introduced myself to Roy and Patty, and then I mentioned him earlier. Peter Schneider came up behind me and kind of pats my shoulder and, "Hey, have you met Roy and Patty?" And I said, "Yeah, we just met." And he's basically patting my shoulder like, "Be good, be on your best behavior." Anyway, well, but they were so down to earth. My cousin and Patty were like, don't you hate dressing up for these events? Don't you hate pantyhose?" And started talking about how you can use nail polish to fix a run in your pantyhose. And I thought,
Yep.
we are good. So sadly, I didn't get a picture with them, but Veronica went home with a nice, lovely picture of her and the Disneys, and it remained on her fridge for about a decade. So
Wow.
that was really, to be honest, that it was just fun sharing with people. I was never impressed with much. When my name was in the credits in Lion King, I remember I did bring family members to the El Capitan. It was a special evening, and actually, my niece was a toddler. She's grown and married and living in London now, but she was a toddler. And I remember because they brought her out to the lobby for the wildebeest stampede, lest she be traumatized. But I remember, my aunt stood up when she saw my name in the credits and was clapping. And I thought, oh, okay. Like, I didn't think much about the glamour, you know what I mean? Or the glory of having my name in
True.
lights. None of it mattered to me. I was a little teary eyed when the sun, when the sun rises and you hear, da, 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 da,
Yeah. Yeah.
because we worked so hard on it. It was fun to
Yeah.
see it finally reaching an audience. But, I just wasn't invested in seeing my name in the credits, but it meant a lot to other people. So I did feel very lucky that I could bring my mom to New York for a premiere, for example, or later I brought them to Paris when I was working at the Paris studio. Those were the rewarding moments.
Hmm. So you worked in Paris for how long?
I say 3.5 months, but I don't know how accurate that is. It could have been 4. And yeah, that was on, strangely, Tarzan. I painted Notre Dame for 18 months on Hunchback, but then, and actually going later, I was it. I had gone to Europe in the early 90s. This was my second time there, but working there, you get to spend more time
Mm-hmm.
experiencing the local color and just absorbing the culture. So I do remember I looked at the interior of Notre Dame, and I thought, wow, I just painted that for 18 months. We got it right, man. We took the time to get
Uh,
it right. But it was strangely, it was on Tarzan that I worked there.
oh, that must be so surreal if you have like studied it, painted it, and then you walk into it for realsies.
It was amazing, but also when it burned, you remember that?
Yes.
That broke my heart just because you've developed a relationship with it. It did break my heart. Well, as it does though, when anything iconic, like I don't want to get political, but when you have a regression and one regime takes over another, the first thing they do is destroy art. And so that's hard for me to watch. Like taking sledgehammers to statues breaks my heart. Thank God Notre
Yeah.
Dame, it's back to its full glory, thankfully.
Yeah, they did a great job. I'm very, very, very happy. I mean, we got to visit it as kids from
Oh,
school because
mm-hmm,
the Netherlands and Paris is like overnight trip by bus, and then you have a day
mm-hmm,
there and then go back again.
mm-hmm.
So it was weird to see it burning on
Heartbreaking.
the news. So, and this city was your home for 4 months.
Yeah, I had been there one other time, but again, living there, I had speaking of traveling from Amsterdam to Paris in one night, you can take the train, you can take an overnight train to Venice. And so
True.
both times I've been to Europe, I did kind of the same circuit: Paris, Venice, Rome. And I had a Eurail
Mm,
pass when I was working there, but I didn't use it. I very much settled in. I had a gym a block from the Louvre and
mm,
had my little routine. I would drink my morning coffee in front of that pyramid every morning before going to my little gym between l'Opéra and the Louvre. So I just felt
mm,
like a citizen. And I did not use my Eurail pass. I just would rather drink my cafe creme in front of the, pyramid and kind of absorb the
mm.
local color and learn the language.
Yeah, yeah, I was gonna ask because I know you learned French from like within Disney. What was the story again? You learned the language. You speak French. Did you
Right.
do that when you were there?
I started taking lessons, in our building at Disney. So basically, because of Euro Disney, a woman who's still a very dear friend, Marie, I'll give her a shout out, Marie Martine Bessot, was hired to teach mostly at Imagineering, but to teach the artists and the engineers French so they could interface during the building of Euro Disney. Well, they kept her
Mm,
on. And it was really just a fun thing for us animators. You could walk down the hall and have something fun to do at lunch. I don't know why they kept her on, but for a good 11 years. And so
mm.
it was right down the hall. I had never learned a language in school. I don't know how. It's a crime, but in the public school system here in Southern California, you had a lot of ors. You could take home and economics or poli sci, political science, and you are
Mm,
not required to learn a language. Didn't happen,
mm,
and so I grew up and I thought I'm inclined toward language. I'm a writer. I love language. I think I might be inclined to do this. So actually, Roger Allers, the director of Lion King, whom I mentioned earlier, we both took
mhm.
this class. And so I learned just enough to be dangerous.
Whilst drinking your coffee in front of the pyramid. That's
Yes.
so nice. That must be to me. Um, when I saw those research strips, um, like on the making of movies,
Hmm.
I thought that was like the coolest thing ever. And to have to travel for work like
I was
this,
going to say, I think,
drawing,
yeah,
oh my God.
I think anytime you can travel for work, it's a gift. It's a blessing. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you, by the way, did you get to do any other trip than this
For
one?
production,
Yeah.
well, not at Disney, but I did later, as you, I think, know. I worked for Animation Lab in Israel. So definitely life
Oh,
changing. Yeah, I'm so
wow.
lucky. Well, the three times that I traveled for work really were Jerusalem, Paris, and then I worked in New York for Blue Sky for about 4 months as well. And got
Mm.
to, I tried everything. I lived in White Plains, right near the studio at one point. Then
Mm.
it's a long story, but at one point they wanted to move the studio to Manhattan, but all the higher ups, the executives, lived out in Connecticut. It's kind of the tri-state area, they call it. So they lived
Mm.
in really beautiful areas, but all the artists ended up having to commute. So I tried everything. I lived in White Plains, then I lived in on a friend's couch in Brooklyn for a while and had to take 3 trains to get there. Then I lived near Union
Wow.
Station in New York. Still, I wrote actually Nameless Prince 2 on the train. I had so much time commuting that I wrote an entire novel. And that's why I didn't end up taking a permanent position. It was too logistically complicated. But yeah, I
Oh,
value that.
wow, that's a
I
lot.
felt like a New Yorker for 3.5 months for work.
Hmm. So which one is your favorite? New York, Paris, Jerusalem?
All so different. But I will say, I'm so glad that I was able to visit Jerusalem because at the time it was a quote unquote war torn country with a lot of terrorism. And people thought I was crazy for doing it. But I said, perhaps naively, I said,
Mm.
it's, in Ireland, even all the IRA bombings over the years, you learn when you see it in the news, it seems very catastrophic, but it's not all day, every day. People still live their lives. So I naively said that about Jerusalem. Like life goes on. I don't think it's all the time everywhere. And then actually, while I was there, Hamas shot up a rabbinical school. They had never actually entered a sacred space and shot it
Oh,
up. But that happened while I was there. And then there were demonstrations and it was pretty tense. But considering, what's been going on the past year, I feel so lucky that I was able to spend time there before things got too out of hand. And yeah, life changing.
wow, that's something. Since you worked at Disney and you got to travel and you worked on all the beautiful projects, you must have had great colleagues or people that maybe you still count as your friends. Or I know you worked with Andreas Deja as
Mm.
well.
Hmm.
Um, how how was that? Like how was to work with such talented artists and have them as your colleague, like your colleague, and
Hmm.
like normal to have as your colleagues? Yeah, okay,
Well,
they're big now. Maybe they weren't as big then, but still.
yeah, some of them were. I think there was that transition period we talked about where Black Cauldron came out and a few others that were, Great Mouse Detective, and
Hmm.
I think the future of animation was pretty uncertain. It wasn't again the Renaissance hadn't happened yet, nor had we recognized it as such, right? But I
Exactly.
do think there was a moment. I mean, I'm kind of not answering your question, but there was a moment where they say, right, that there was no real storytelling sense because you did have animators like Glenn Keane and Andreas who were coming up, but then the 9 old men had already moved on or passed away, right? And so there was nobody at the helm with a real storytelling sense. So if you
Hmm.
watch Black Cauldron, there's some really beautiful animated sequences that are really lively. There's even some really beautiful backgrounds, but again, without a solid story, it's kind of wasted energy. And so I do think these people were known, but it was a transition period. They weren't superstars like they are now, that's for sure. Everybody
Mm.
knows Brad Bird, for example, right? And so I think
Mm.
the general public is more aware post Renaissance. But to answer your
True.
question, the answer is one word. How was it working with creative geniuses and master storytellers all day, every day? It was heaven.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And you kind of said last time, has it ever happened again? And I said, nope.
That was, how is that? Is that sad or is that
Of course. But no,
okay?
it's disillusioning by definition, right? So working for other cultures and other studios, it's only
Mm.
down from there. So very
Right.
disillusioning. And I've had a learning curve about not lowering my expectations. You mentioned Andreas a moment ago, and I think your initial question was, how was it working with such formidable artists and storytellers? Don't mean to put words in your mouth. And have you kept in touch with them? So what I should have said is, yes, I've got lifelong friends out of it. I think I told you Roger and I regularly reminisce about what a magic moment in time that was. And Andreas has remained a good friend. So to bring it full circle, when I said earlier, a big fringe benefit of working there was just being able to share the magic with friends and family. Again, taking my parents to New York or Paris. I took my sister one year to Andreas's pretty famous Christmas party. He's known for, yes, kind of lavish, but more importantly, you'll get the idea if I tell the story. So, my sister's a singer songwriter and a vocal coach, and has been immersed in musical theater among other things for years. And we walk into the Christmas party, and there's one of the Sherman brothers. I think one had already passed, But basically, they did everything from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang to literally It's a Small World, the song you hear on the ride. And, he sits down to the piano and plays It's a Small World the way it was originally written. Much slower in tempo, a lot more poetic. And then you look around the room. Oh, there's the voice of Tinkerbell. There's the voice of Sleeping Beauty. And for me, the topper was the voice of Mowgli. I am a huge fan of both Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book and the Disney version of it. I saw Jungle Book at the 10-year mark in the theaters because I was just the right age to catch it at the 10-year mark. And there's the voice, and he's not an old man, not a single gray hair in his head. He's just a dude, just a cool guy. So that was a little bit of stardust that I was able to share with my sister. And it's not about the glamour, it's just about the legacy. We have what was called the Animation Research Library, and they were responsible for pretty much documenting and archiving everything. But they didn't go to nearly the lengths to interview everybody who's still alive as Andreas and his partner Roger. So I would say to this day, Andreas is the real hub. Anybody that's remotely attached to the Disney legacy who's still alive, Andreas is in touch with them and kind of holds it all together, especially at this Christmas party. It's pretty amazing. So, yeah, that was a really fun moment that I was able to share with my sister. Those are pretty rare characters, and I was very fortunate to be surrounded by, and I was hinting at spiritual people, remember? Like,
Yes,
they're not
I
just
do.
visionary artists that inspire me, but frankly, they have substance. And I use the word spiritual pretty loosely, and to me, it doesn't need to trigger anybody. It's so not okay to use that word, but I just mean everything that's not your body.
Of
So,
course, yeah.
yeah, so people that have a clue about emotional maturation and, you know, spiritual evolution, which just means it has nothing to do with religion, put it that way. So yeah, having the podcast, I've had Greg Spolenko back on and people like Andreas, whom I have kept in touch with, Don
Mm,
Hahn, whom I have kept in touch with. I mentioned Roger, one of the two directors of Lion King. So there was Roger Ellers and Rob Minkoff. I've kept in
mm,
touch with Roger, and as I was saying, we do reminisce. We do thank the Lord that we were part of that pivotal moment in time that actually changed the face of, you name it, pop culture or the noosphere, our
mm.
trajectory, our march toward human potential. And I'm sounding a little bit like I'm exaggerating, but I don't think it's anything less than that. So yes, I feel so lucky, but I've mainly gotten back in touch with it by doing the podcast and realizing even though there may be a shortage of people with substance in my world, even though I do view us as more consumerist than ever and maybe more superficial than ever, I've been lucky enough to have some pretty formidable people in my life as mentors, as influences, as friends, and just very grateful for that. I don't know if that answers the question, but I try to focus on those luminaries, right? It's easy to get down
Mhm.
days, and I think what you put your attention on grows. So the podcast has been a wonderful opportunity to put my focus on the people that are making a difference in the world in the ways I recognize, and then bolstering that sort of interconnectivity. And I think we all, especially the next 4 years in this country, we are going to need to band together. And for example, like even political satire, Facebook. People are posting things right and left about this crucial moment. And I saw a friend had posted, I forget exactly what it was, but it kind of poked fun at the inauguration ceremony. And it was very funny. I'm not going to remember what it was, but it's very funny. And then I saw in the comments, probably a conservative right wing friend of his chimed in and said, "This is not funny. No place for humor." And I found myself, I rarely get engaged, but I wanted to support him. So in the comments, I didn't respond to her. She's a stranger, but I said to my friend Mark, keep it up. We're going to need not just art to redeem us the next 4 years, or arguably our entire fascist oligarchy future, once right, free and fair elections have gone by the
Mm.
wayside. We're going to need not just art, we're going to need specifically political satire, right?
Yes.
In the face of fascism, political satire has been the only way to forge social evolution, right? So everywhere from Aristotle, where he fought for the Greek tragedies because they provided catharsis, through the French Revolution, those pamphlets that were distributed that resulted in the French Revolution and frankly, the American Revolution. If you didn't have people actually dragging Marie Antoinette through the mud in these little pamphlets, equivalent of political cartoons now, right? Or even cartoons that might appear in a newspaper. We we wouldn't have had those revolutions. As we said last time, right? We don't need heads on stakes, but we do need people that are passionate and that want to preserve our humanity. And I would say the same, in the face of World War II. You had your propaganda on the side of the fascists, but you also had subversive movements that were the only reason we were able to get past that in our dialectic. So sorry for the tangent, but I am
Mhm.
banding together with kindred spirits right now. It's more important than ever that we artists
Mm.
understand why we do what we do, why we storytellers do what we do.
Well, that sounds like it sounds like you could be like a great spearhead for that. I might misread that, but I mean, you are a very great storyteller, and story has been throughout your life.
Thank you
Uh,
for saying that. I mean, I think we're all taking a minute to figure out what our strategy is going to be. I was paralyzed, once here we are at the inauguration. But
mm,
after the results of the election came out, I think we were all
mm.
deers in the headlights. How the hell did we get here? It's all surreal.
Again,
And then we have to, a lot of people are saying we need to lick our wounds, then rebound, then figure out our strategy. Actually, talk about pushing my buttons. A friend online basically said that we all need to just, what's it called? Like recharge and then band together and then figure out what we're going to do. And I let her have it. In the comments, I said, because she's pretty well to do, and she's pretty comfortable, meaning has money.
mhm,
And so, it's really easy to get complacent and just live your life without contributing. And so I let her have it. I said, "You mean do what I've been doing? And now you're suddenly listening because I didn't say that, I was a little nicer, but I thought now that you're immediately affected and you're worried about your future, suddenly you care to contribute to collective humanity? What do you think my podcast is about?" Some of us have been doing it to deaf ears.
yeah, here's the link.
Yeah, so I don't have any answers, and I'm just as futile. My hands are thrown in the air like everybody else. But I do know I do have, one property that's political satire by definition, that not just pokes fun at this administration, but is anti-fascism. And I will be pounding the pavement and trying to get it made. So that's the one thing I'm looking forward to in all of this.
Interesting. And you're doing that whilst you're keeping the amazing friends.
You're back to the friends. I love it. Um, well, I am choosing, again, we choose what to give airtime to, right? And what you put your attention on grows. So I don't get involved in the complaining online. I'm just choosing to surround myself with kindred spirits. And it doesn't mean living in a bubble, right?
No.
Or engaging in confirmation
Mhm.
bias or any of those things, but it does mean maybe surrounding yourself with inspiring people. And so, yeah, feel pretty blessed. I think we artists do need to remind each other why we do what we do.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me pick your brain. Thank you for letting me be the one that got to do this.
You put in so much time. I so appreciate your valuable time. Thank you so much.
Mm.
Mostly for the opportunity to reminisce. I'm so nostalgic, and I hope we hit on some of the magic of that period of time, and maybe it'll make a comeback. We hope. You know,
Oh my God, that will be so nice. I mean, I was 6 years old when I saw the making of the Lion King, the lions in the studio, and I saw all these men with the big boards, and they were laughing with each other. I mean, there was lions there, but they are
oh,
laughing
you
with
saw.
each
Okay,
other, right? And
right.
and with the boards and doing the drawing and go like, oh yes. And I was sick and I did not get what was going on there, but I just knew these are my people. I need to be here. But
Wow.
because in the Netherlands, we don't know what animation is, and we only do the perpetuating of the starving artists, I had nowhere to go, basically. Like, my uncle would tease me, like, oh, if you want to work for Disney, can you paint or can you draw the same thingy twice? Oh, no, then, you cannot go there.
I
There
want to
was
tell.
all these, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of misconceptions too. I will say, there's at my gym, my a friend in the neighborhood basically is a great artist, but he works at a gym. for years,
Mm.
he's worked at the gym, and we talk creative things here and there. But at one point, he said, "Yeah, I just couldn't do it. I was offered a job in animation and just couldn't do those 24 frames per second, all the repetitiveness." And he actually was offered a job as a background painter. And I thought, well, the joke's on him because you paint the background once.
Yeah,
And so,
it's a completely different job,
yeah,
guy,
sometimes
mister.
things can be tedious on production, absolutely. But, so many departments and so many cogs in that machine. But I do want to say, with regard to not really having access where you grew up, do you know Klaus Tovig, the producer of Song of the Sea? Yeah, he's the producer, and I can
Ah.
hook you up with him on LinkedIn. But, there is a lot of production going on. Sorry for my ignorance, but certainly in Scandinavia, maybe not in Amsterdam or the Netherlands, but all over Scandinavia. And he's always hiring. Klaus?
Always give my name.
Yeah, I'll make an introduction. I just think actually European animation is way more experimental and more interesting to me. But of course, it's hard to get work
That is true.
visas. Sometimes they have to use local
Yeah.
talent and all of that.
Well, we here the whole island culture gets perpetuated, or I don't know, encouraged. So they want to have people with deep, meaningful projects, and then ask for budget, and then they can do that thing on their own, and they will do the backgrounds themselves. They will do the whatever themselves. It's islands. We don't have the commercial part where you can just, go and paint backgrounds all day, and then, come back and go there again and do. That's not that's not a thing here. Like, we all are very deep and very artistic and very boring.
Oh my God. Well, I
I'm
think too, there's a model of, more and more things get farmed out. So you might have packages that are created, like the intellectual property gets developed to a point and then it's just simply farmed out. So it becomes like a machine. I think it's really great when it's all done under one roof. Disney would farm things out here and
Mhm.
there, but it was pretty
Yeah.
much under one roof. Anyway, thank you again. I really appreciate it. Any final words of wisdom or anything else you want to talk about?
Words of wisdom from me. You are the wise
Yeah.
one here.
Well, we'll have you on as a guest. We're going to have you on as a guest at some point.
Really?
I'm so tired.
Oh, that's gonna be fun. That will be fun. Yes, you go to you. Have your day. I
Oh, well,
shall have
thank
my
you.
day.
Okay. Thank you so much. And to
Give
our
me a big hug.
listeners, hugs from afar. Okay. And to our listeners, remember, life is story. And we can get our hands in the clay. Individually and collectively, we can write a new story. See you next time.
We want to take a moment to thank our wonderful listeners and supporters. Your continued support and sharing of our podcast helps us spread the transformative power of storytelling. If you enjoy our episodes, please rate and review us on your favorite platform and share the podcast with friends and family. For more enriching conversations and insights, subscribe to Language of the Soul podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media and visit our Patreon website for the latest updates and exclusive content. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to life. If you'd like to support us further, consider joining our Patreon community for exclusive content and donation options. Every bit of support helps us reach more hearts and minds.